So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our day 4 of our Ecological Economics for All Summer Crash Course with the theme, The Shift Needed in Economics to Enable a Just Transition to a Right-Sized Economy. Welcome. I would like to once again thank our co-sponsors, the Leadership for the Eco-swaraj, the Ghana Institute for Environment, Rethinking Economics, UVM, the International Society for Ecological Economics, the Bittersdorf Professorship in Sustainability Science and Policy, and the Democracy Collaborative. I would like to give a special, on our final day, I would like to give a special day, thank you to our collaborators. This course wouldn't have been possible if John Erickson and Joshua Farley had not believed in it and from the beginning. And this has been months in preparation, and just getting it out there was incredibly important that they believed in it from the beginning. Aaron Vansintak, who's a new postdoc here with us, Nina Smoliar, Tina Beji, and Matt Burke. Thank you so much for your collaborations. So once again, quick intro to what we're trying to do here with Ecological Economics for All. We're trying to follow the Noam Meadows' vision, tools for sustainability to a transition to sustainability, including visioning, truth-telling, networking, collaborating, co-learning, and loving. We believe that ecological economics has a very important story to tell, and we want to tell it. So we have global participation for the crash course from around the world, 30% from North America and the Caribbean and Central America, 8% from South America, 36% from Europe, 6% from Africa, 18% from Asia, and 2% from Oceania. We are really moved and just thankful for all of you who want to learn about ecological economics to hopefully improve your world. I asked you when you register what best describes you. A bunch of you were undergraduate, graduate students, postdocs, teachers, academics, practitioners, activists, many of you in the private and public sectors, and a bunch of you call yourselves some sort of hybrid. And today, by the way, we have people who I believe are very much hybrids of academic, activists and practitioners. So we have a great set of speakers today. Have you ever taken a course on economics? Most of you say yes, 76%, 24% said no. Have you ever taken a course on pluralist or heterodox economics? And 58% said no, 37% said yes, other was 5%. So hopefully you have learned a lot more about heterodox economics and ecological economics during these last 4 days. So during the last 3 days, many of you have had a lot of comments that I read, or even during the first breakout group, about how we might be late. Many of you said to address climate change. So how good is ecological economics to move us forward? But we have a problem, right? We depend a lot on fossil energy, and this graph of energy consumption and GDP growth shows that nexus between the two. And what we largely believe in ecological economics is that 50 limits to grow 50 years later, we gotta be concerned as much as climate change as it is for depleting our resources and not being ready by diversifying our energy systems and reducing our consumption and moving towards efficiency. So it is, if this is correct, which has been mostly correct, we gotta be working on this no matter what and try to address what's gonna happen with our resource base as much as with our pollution. And yeah, so that's why we need new economic and financial theories for these, decreasing energy supplies, and to be able to adapt to have a more, sustainable and equitable well-being for everyone. So I will leave you for the last quote of the 4 days. Noam Meadows wrote in 1992 in Beyond Limits, a sustainable society is one that can persist over generations, one that is far-seeing enough, flexible enough, and wise enough not to undermine either its physical or social systems of support. And that being said, today is day 4, a new way of economic teaching, practice, and policy making. Our first speaker is Ashish Kothari, who basically is everything. He has written or he has co-authored or edited more than 30 books. He runs a very important NGO in India, and I send all of you his very detailed bio. So you can go back to the website if you want to read it. I don't want to take more of the time, so I'll just gonna hand it over to him. And by the way, we should be really appreciative because he's in Indian time, which I believe is 9:30 p.m. And it's just we're just extremely grateful for him to even be here, and not he probably should just be sleeping. Thank you so much. Take it away. Oh, let me stop sharing.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Rigo. Can I be heard? All right. Okay, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm very glad to be with you all. It's yes, it's 9:45 in the night, but more than that, actually, I've just landed this morning in Ladakh, which is 3,300 meters above sea level. So if I say things which are a little incomprehensible, I will use that as an excuse that I'm in a very high altitude zone, still acclimatizing. But very glad to be with you all. And I should say that I think I'm part of those 24% who said they've never taken a course in economics. So I am not an economist and don't also think of myself as an ecological economist, but a lot of the work that I've been doing and looking at transformations on the ground, of course, intersects with the economy in very fundamental ways. So I'm going to look at those intersections and the kinds of transformations that are happening on the ground, but also then what are the kind of frameworks of alternatives that are emerging in different parts of the world. So I'll get straight into it. If it's okay, I'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion and not encroach into Kate's time. Right, can you see the slides? Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, so I think in terms of the background, the bad news part of it, we're all familiar with it, so I'm not going to go into any kind of detail. But we do know that development in the way it's been spread all over the world and imposed across the global south especially has also meant, it has of course created benefits for a lot of people, but it has also meant extreme forms of violence for the rest of nature, as you see in this advertisement, and for ourselves in many different ways, and especially for communities most directly dependent on nature and natural resources for their livelihoods, their cultural survival, etc. And the shift from a lot of the traditional livelihoods that were nature dependent and in some ways in relative harmony with the rest of nature, from that to sort of modern Western industrialized society, where you create jobs that are, for the most part, for most people, extremely mechanical and soul deadening. So I actually think of that as a shift from livelihoods, which is not just jobs, but livelihoods, to deadlihoods in many different ways. We've also seen in the COVID pandemic how the exploitative sectors of society, the nation state, the private corporations have used this period to actually increase their political power or their economic profits. But on the other hand, we've also seen some incredible examples all over the world of solidarity, of people helping each other, of people jumping out of their skins to be able to express mutual aid in many different forms. And that's the part, the part of human characteristics or human life, which I'd like to focus on much more than the bad news, which anyway is all around us. Because I think the biggest question that we face right now is this model of development and everything that underlies it, is that an inevitable path that we have to take? Which is what, if you look at Margaret Thatcher's famous dictum, there is no alternative. Or do we actually have viable alternatives? And I believe that we do, looking at experience from all over the world, alternatives broadly of two kinds. One is where people are saying, no, we don't accept this system anymore. We will resist. And we will resist not in terms of saying that, okay, if there's waste, let's do recycling. Or okay, if there's carbon emissions, let's just capture that carbon somewhere. But to actually challenge the fundamental structures and relations of exploitation and unsustainability, whether they are private corporations and capitalism, or their nation state domination, or older forms of inequality and unsustainability, patriarchy, racism, and the feeling that human beings are at the center of the universe. So when people resist these, they're actually also challenging them in terms of narratives, which are very different from what this kind of exploitative structures tell us. So for instance, this image is of a demonstration by indigenous peoples in central India 30 years back against two mega hydroelectricity projects. And when they were protesting against it, they were talking not just about the fact that our villages will be submerged, our livelihoods will be destroyed, our forest will be destroyed, but also that this river is our mother, and we will not allow our mother to be shackled by your dreams of progress. So in a way, you can actually see different ways of knowing, different ways of being, different ways of relating to the rest of nature and to each other. And you see this in widespread resistance movements all over the world, even now, whether it's the youth climate justice movements or the incredible farmers movement that we've just seen in India, the anti-racism movements, the peace movements in Myanmar, movements for new constitutions in Chile, what's happening in Colombia right now, etc. And why these are very crucial is because, as I said, it's not just challenging the structures and the superficial solutions that they give us, including what's happening right now in terms of, let's say, the net zero movement all over the world. With the COP26, all countries started talking about, okay, by 2050, 2060, 2070, we will be net zero. And to a lot of these movements, and in my understanding, these are very superficial solutions. They're essentially solutions that help the current system to continue remaining dominant, and only very superficially and sort of gloss over the kinds of problems and greenwash them. Whereas what we need is much more fundamental transformations. And that's the second kind of alternative, where people are actually coming up with solutions, with ways of being and doing and acting, which are meeting the needs of human beings, the aspirations of human beings, without trashing the earth and without causing the kinds of inequalities and injustice that we see in the current system. Obviously, today we don't have the time to go into all of these. I'm going to give a quick glimpse of some of them and then come to what I think are the sort of broad frameworks of transformation that are emerging. This one from southern India is one of my most inspiring, the one that's inspired me most in the last 30 years. This comes from Dalit women farmers. Dalits are the most marginalized section of Indian society, the so-called outcasts or untouchables. As women, they're marginalized in patriarchy, and they're very small farmers, 1 or 2 acres of land. They faced hunger, malnutrition, lack of access to education, health, etc., like Dalit families all over India. But over the last 30 years, they've actually brought back their traditional cultivation of a very large diversity of seeds. They've reclaimed complete sovereignty over food, including land and knowledge and seeds and water. They've shared things, they've built collectives to make all of this happen, and then move towards what they call food sovereignty, not just food security. And in the COVID pandemic, amazingly, the same women and the same families that were facing hunger 30 years back have been contributing to the food relief measures of the local administration, providing whatever food they produce for themselves, but also to this relief. All the way across the world, in the Andean highlands of Peru, the Quechua indigenous community is doing something very similar, having claimed complete territorial sovereignty over their large biocultural heritage area, which is also one of the origins of the potato, growing a huge diversity of crops, and moving towards food sovereignty and being extremely resilient again in the COVID pandemic period. We move to Central Asia, Central East, Western Asia, where a pretty incredible eco-feminist movement is trying to create a large region of peace in the midst of one of the most war-torn areas of the earth, the Iran, Iraq, Syria border and Turkey border. And through a eco-feminist ideology called genealogy, trying to create peace with the earth, but also much more radical forms of local democracy, much more social justice, and so on. Over to Europe, where in the midst of some of the most capitalist societies in the world, there are attempts to try and create non-capitalist economies, solidarity economies of workers taking control over factories and running them democratically, including, for instance, this one in Greece, in Thessaloniki, coming up with the principle that every worker will get exactly the same wage as every other worker for every hour of work, regardless of what the work is. So it's trying to bring much more radical equality into the workspace. Or for instance, the school, which is run with very high quality standards, but with very low fees, because the entire community around it provides some free services like some teaching and some administration, etc. Local currencies in Luxembourg and other places, and much else. I mean, there are many such examples of trying to um, create examples of non-capitalist economies, which are much more about caring and sharing and equality. In the midst of another very capitalist society, this is in Copenhagen, the attempt to try and create a anarchist living with no private property, the Christiania in Copenhagen, and similar one in India, in southern India, called Auroville, where, for instance, all the businesses are run by cooperatives. Many households will together own or use machinery or vehicles rather than every single family having one. No private property, no inheritance of houses, etc. So very radically different ways of economic living. We also have the movements of feminist municipalism in many parts of the earth, of the world, especially in Europe, where again the attempt is to try and create politics in running of cities, for instance, which are much more about cooperation rather than hostile, intense competition between political parties. We've done documentation of a lot of examples over the last 2 years of these kinds, where communities in villages and cities have been able to show much greater resilience to the COVID pandemic, both for health and for things like food and livelihoods. We have more than 70 examples from India and many from around the world that are being put together. I'll put the links in the chat when I finish so that you can all look at these. You can download them for free. Okay, let me now move into what kind of sort of broad frameworks of alternatives emerge from these and thousands of other examples all over the world. Broadly, we think of this as a kind of a flower of transformation with 5 spheres or 5 petals of this flower: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. And at the center of this flower of transformation, the most important part of the story is the ethics, the values, the principles. I'm not going to go into each of these in detail. I'll put in the chat documentation where much more is written about these. But let me just give a kind of a glimpse of the sorts of transformations people are already trying out, and much more, of course, needs to be done. So when we come to democracy, for instance, what these movements are saying is that democracy is not about going for elections and then hoping that the political party that is put into power will do the right thing for us. It's actually about us claiming power where we are. It's born in us. And like, for instance, in central India, a community says, while we elect the government in New Delhi, in our village, we are the government. All decisions will be taken by us or through us, and not by some bureaucrats or some politician, somebody sitting somewhere else. There are many different forms of this kind of radical democracy in different parts of the world. What's this kind of politics also tells us, especially when it's connected to ecological and cultural transformation, is that even the current political boundaries, nation state boundaries especially, need to be challenged, because many of them are cutting across river flows or mountain ecosystems or cultural flows. Many of them are results of colonial history, and unless we challenge them, we will not be able to try and move towards an ecologically and culturally much more responsible governance. These are also struggles of challenging both traditional and new forms of hierarchy and inequality, whether it is gender or sexualities or race or caste, because without that also transformations will be very incomplete. These are also movements of trying to bring back respect for cultural diversity, decolonizing the kind of hegemonic knowledge and cultural imposition that has happened for the last 500 years, and trying to bring back a great diversity of languages, of food traditions, of ways of being, of ways of knowing, and respecting them, trying to build more collaboration amongst them, which means also then, for instance, the struggles against intellectual property rights, against copyright, against patented software, etc. Um, since we're talking about ecological economics, a little bit more focus here on the economic part of transformation, which is to say that we're talking about an economics which recognizes ecology as being core. And after all, both of these words come from the same initial oikos, the Greek word oikos, which is home. And as somebody very famously said, how can you manage home, which is economics, without first understanding home, which is ecology, right? So why is it that departments of economics actually hardly teach ecology? So how do one bring that back, and the sense of ecological limits and so on, which I'm sure Kate, of course, is going to talk about much more. But this transformation in economics then is also about challenging globalization and bringing back localization, which is much more self-reliance, self-sufficiency, but a localization that is not xenophobic, that doesn't say we won't take refugees, we don't accept XYZ because they're from outside, but to say we build these local economies, but they're open localization where refugees, for instance, are also welcome, where production facilities are controlled by workers, like the example I gave of the Greek factory in Thessaloniki, where we actually start to bring back to integrate work and leisure. Today we have this very Western concept of weekdays and weekends, and we desperately wait for the weekend to enjoy ourselves. Well, if the work itself is enjoyable, we don't need those kind of divisions. We can do whatever we want at whatever point in time if it's enjoyable. So that kind of breaking the binary between work and leisure, for instance, is also part of this transformation. It's about challenging private property, the example I gave you of Christiania. It's about challenging the central role of money, especially money controlled by banks and governments in our lives, and trying to see how do we demonetize our own lives much more. And it's about then putting all of this together into a very different set of indicators of well-being, which rubbish is GDP, which truly is a rubbish indicator, and says, okay, real indicators of well-being would be, do we have enough clean drinking water? Do we have clean air? Do we all have good places to live? Do we have good opportunities for learning? Do we have voice in decision making, etc.? And the final sphere of transformation, of course, probably the most important, is reintegrating ourselves with the rest of nature. Again, what's happened through the last few hundred years is to think of ourselves being separate from nature, which is the left-hand side image, the so-called ecological pyramid. But actually what we are is a circle of life, where we are one of thousands and thousands of species. So understanding that, understanding our own humble place within nature, and then talking about, for instance, not just human rights, but also the rights of the rest of nature. And as I said, at the center of this flower of transformation is a set of principles and values, which I'm just going to put out there, a bunch of them, not go into detail, we don't have the time for that. But these are all things that have emerged from these grounded radical alternatives. And they're very deep fundamental challenges to the currently dominant system. For instance, this fourth bullet point emphasizes cooperation and not competition. It emphasizes the commons and not the private property, etc. Or you talk about, for instance, labor. Why is it that mental labor is considered to be more higher status and worthy of more economic remuneration compared to physical labor? So again, sort of breaking down that kind of binary. It's about rights of nature, as I already mentioned, not just human rights. It's about being nonviolent, not just in terms of physical actions, but also language, also culture, also how we relate to each other and to the rest of nature. And so basically, we're talking about worldviews that celebrate not money, not fame, not power, but life. And how do we bring those back into our lives? So from India, a particular framework that has emerged based on experiences here is what we call Eco-swaraj. The word swaraj means self-rule, but it doesn't simply mean that I am autonomous and free to do what I want, but that I will assert my autonomy, our community will assert its autonomy, but with respect to and responsibility towards your autonomy, your well-being, your freedom, which means we have to also be restrained in our consumption patterns and our production patterns. But essentially, this idea is very simple. We are all decision makers, we are all holders of power, and we exercise that power with responsibility towards other people and other species. There are similar notions from all over the world. Some are very ancient from indigenous peoples and coming back in modern movements, such as various versions of when we were in Latin America. Some are radical reinterpretations of major religions, which otherwise can be extremely exploitative. And some are new ones emerging from the belly of the beast, from capitalist societies themselves, like degrowth and ecofeminism and so on. At the last, what I'll say is that I think what we need as we emerge out of the COVID pandemic, or as we try and emerge from multiple other global crises, is not just a Green New Deal, which a lot of people are talking about and has become quite a thing in USA and Europe and in South Korea, but actually sort of what I call a Rainbow New Deal, which is multiple different revolutions, where you're not focusing only on one sphere of life, and thinking of how does one bring about the different transformations that I've been talking about in a more holistic way. There are many examples of proposals for this from Southern Africa, from Hawaii, and emerging from peoples all over the world. One question I often get asked is, it's okay to think about and look at all these examples all over the world, but how do we bring macro change? Because these are mostly very small, scattered, etc. And to me, what is important is not trying to copy a successful example, say in one part of India, in another part of India, or in Latin America, or to upscale, which is to make a single example bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a sort of corporate way of looking at it. But what I call outscaling, which is to learn the lessons from these incredible examples and then apply them in our own context with whatever modifications are necessary, and then network, build horizontal solidarity and networking to create that larger scale. And this is the kind of thing that's already happening with things like, say, agroecology or say the feminist movement. In India, we've started a process to try and bring together a lot of these alternative initiatives for collaboration, for learning, for visioning, called Vikalp Sangam, or the confluence of alternatives. Since about 2014, there are more than 80 movements and organizations in India that are involved with this. And then learning from this, we also help to initiate with similar networks in other parts of the world, the global tapestry of alternatives, which is trying to create that kind of horizontal linkage of radical alternatives in different parts of the world through dialogues, mutual solidarity, collaborations, etc. Just to end with saying that there's a number of books that bring out a lot of this, which are available in multiple languages. We did a book 2 years back called Pluriverse, which has 100 examples from all over the world, which is now available in Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian also. And the book Alternative Futures is actually futuristic visions of India in different fields of life for 2100, and then coming back down to earth and saying, what are the pathways of getting there to that kind of a ideal vision. So these are all available again for free PDF download. I'll put the links in the chat as soon as I finish. So thanks a lot for that. I hope I haven't taken more time than given, and I'd be very happy to be part of a discussion after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashish. That was amazing. We desperately needed that perspective from you, and from a lot from I provided your book to them with your permission, a Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, which is just amazing. So I guess we're gonna get started with the questions. We have somebody here asking, how can people of color take the lead in the development field or academia besides putting our bodies in the front line? It's very common that in both fields, including ecological economics, white people studying people color movements receive much more legitimization than people of color, speaking from our direct experiences. So the question, how can people of color take the lead in the development field or academia besides putting our bodies in the front lines?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very, very important one. I think there's a number of things we need Firstly, for those of us who are, say from the global south or people of color, so to speak, to build the confidence amongst ourselves that we do have agency, that we have also got our own thoughts and ideas and knowledge systems and perspectives, which are as important as anybody else in the world. We may be victims of colonialism or various forms of discrimination and exploitation, but we are much more than victims. We are also enablers and actors for our own transformation. That's one thing, but also that becomes easier the more we're actually able to exchange with each other, the more we're able to bring to build, say, global South-South solidarity as an example. The second is to insist that people from the global North, who have been exploiting us for so long, accept this reality of us having agency, and don't look at us. What happens often also is that they're looking at us from the point of view of, okay, we'll help you people. It's a bit of a patronizing kind of an attitude, even from the progressive global North. Not everybody, I think many are very different, but many are also like that. And to actually tell them that it's not about your helping us, it's firstly about your helping yourself. Because in many ways, global capitalism or global, the nation states and the systems that we have are also exploiting you psychologically, if not otherwise. And to enable you yourself to become much more holistic human beings, you need to first be able to transform yourselves. People often ask me, say, okay, how can we help you with your transformation? And I say, first, look at yourselves, look at your own governments, look at your own economies, look at your global footprint, right? You can think of Scandinavia as being apparently the most ecologically conscious countries in the world. Every year there's this environmental ranking and Scandinavia comes up front. But if you look at Scandinavia's global ecological footprint, I don't think that is how it should be projected. So look at that, and how do you transform that so you actually create more global ecological space for the global South, which you've actually taken over. So that's also very, very important, I think, to do. And lastly, storytelling. We need to tell the stories of where the global South is making those transformations happen. This is why the examples I gave you from so many parts of the world, where that transformation is happening. Unfortunately, what's happened also for us is that we tend to focus a lot on the bad news, on the scandals and the murders and the war. And of course, we need to, because that's important. But let's also focus as much on the positive stories people are bringing about, especially from the global North, and then build the collaborations in that sense across the world. Thank you. I know that these are short answers. They will not be satisfactory, but I hope that gives some room for thought.
That was a great answer, and you're doing a great job and in trying to help us understand all these alternatives. People might not realize this, but I lived half of my life in Guatemala, and then we moved to the United States with my family. And a lot of my drive to care about the environment and even ecological economics is I saw what I saw and what I continue to hear about, the terrible calamities done by the global North to our countries that make us flee to different places. And so we gotta keep working, and we gotta change the North and not be patronizing, for sure. I completely agree with you. Are you familiar with wait, sorry, I speak Spanish and I can't even read this. Is Marinela, Spain, another example of democratically, locally controlled community and economy? The Village Against the World by Dan Wilcox, says the questionnaire. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it. I do actually want to know much more. I actually I heard about it just before the pandemic, and I was actually due to come to Spain in 2020, and I was hoping to actually visit, but that hasn't happened. So hopefully sometime soon. But I would be very happy to have contacts with the people there, or with people working with them, and to also build that collaboration through the global tapestry. So again, we can learn from each other. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. There's another question here by Lisa. Are there aspects of the examples you share that are globally relevant or universal? Or will each model need to be adapted fully to various localities?
I believe that the kind of diversity we have all over the world, it's very difficult to exactly replicate something. But the principles can be learned. And so, for instance, agroecology, right? There are, in every place that agroecological experiments are taking place, or where it's being sustained from traditional systems, it would appear to be different because the local soil might be different, the seeds might be different, etc. But some basic principles are very similar. Working with the earth, always trying to understand, respect the earth itself, working with the seeds and understanding, respecting the seeds, working collectively rather than as individual farmers. So those are the principles that I think we can very easily learn from any of these examples, and then come and use them in our own context, which is different from replication. But and also then build the collaborations where maybe some of those farmers can come to our place, or some of those people who've done, I don't know, alternative software or local currencies or whatever, depending on what sector you're working in, is to have the exchange programs where we can then learn from each other with these experiences, so that the modifications are also constantly evolving as we go along and find problems and try and find solutions for them. So I don't even call these models, because the term model seems to suggest that you can just simply replicate it anywhere else. I usually just think of them as being examples, inspiring examples from where others can learn and do things for themselves.
Yes, I think that mentality of universalities, right? How do we, like the sustainable development goals, trying to apply them to everyone when what we need is post-development dictionaries like yours.
Yeah, so I think Rigo, if I just add to that, when the five of us as editors were putting together the post-development dictionary, this was the question we faced. We said, we're talking about a pluriverse, which is, diversity and respecting that. But is there anything universal? How do we connect them? What are the binding threads, so to speak? How do we put the tapestry together, right? And that's why we said that it's the values that perhaps could be universal. The value of solidarity, the value of diversity itself, the value of generosity, of caring, of sharing. So if we can think of that, but they also get manifested differently in different parts of the world, but they are in that sense common, and that's what kind of could be thought of as being universal.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. Phil asks, in the USA, we have the technology to govern directly, he says, but we aren't. Is your goal to let Indians govern India directly to the full extent possible with technology, or do you favor delegating control of national government and regional government?
No, I think the model, the sort of what should I say, the sort of approach to democracy that I'm talking about is where the most important element of democracy is face-to-face decision making, where you actually have 300 people, 500 people, 1,000 people. Could be an urban neighborhood, it could be a village, it could be another kind of collective, are able to actually dialogue, discuss, work things out, build decision making through consensus rather than majority, minority, etc. That is connected to the next such neighborhood and the next such neighborhood, and build larger landscapes of decision making, which don't assume their own power. They are accountable to that lowest grounded level of democracy. Now, if we do that, then we're talking about perhaps India as a nation state may not even then exist. Now, I know I'm risking myself in saying this, because here in India we have a government that's extremely repressive right now, and they could think I'm being anti-national. But basically what I'm saying is that, look, if the region between, I'm sitting in Ladakh right now, which adjoins Tibet, right? Tibet's been taken over by China, Ladakh is being ruled by India. But this area has actually been managed by nomadic pastoral communities for hundreds of years, and it has had wildlife moving back and forth. Right now, you have a fence between the two nation states. That has to be challenged. If we really want truly ecologically and culturally responsible and respectful decision making, that kind of thing has to be challenged. So in that sense, autonomy is with the communities on the ground, but they're building larger levels of exchange and relationships, especially cultural relationships and economic ones, all the way up to the globe. Now, exactly what that system would look like, I don't think anybody has a sort of a easy answer right now. What would global governance look like? It would have to go beyond the United Nations and be the United Peoples of the world. But what would that mean? What would it look like? These are all things that we need to work out through dialogue and experimentation. So that's how I would think of it, rather than thinking of India as governing itself. Because India could be governing itself. It is governing itself, but it could still be repressive for that local community or for wildlife, right? So we have to think very differently of governance itself.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And your example of where you're at between China and India reminds me of the United States and Mexico. These call for walls, and then completely undermining the biodiversity, the regional, ecological, and the human connections that already had existed for even before when the United States was created. And that's just absolutely, unsustainable and just plain wrong. And yeah, so I completely agree. And yeah, let me go to the next question before I get too emotional here. How do we prevent...
Sorry, Rigo, if I can, because just to make this very clear, thanks for that example, is to say that, what people are trying to imagine now is, let's take the wolf as an example, right? Now, the wolf ranged all the way from Northern America, Canada, all the way down into Mexico and probably beyond. Can we reimagine that as a corridor of decision making? Not by the wolf, but by us, but also respecting the territory and the range of the wolf. It's the same thing with the oceans, right? I mean, the oceans cannot have political boundaries, because the turtles are moving 2,000 kilometers in their migration routes. But the same thing with human communities. We have been moving back and forth. So reimagining that, in terms of bioregionalism or biocultural regionalism, there's a lot of very interesting ideas and some local experimentation happening in different parts of the world, and we really need to go much further in that. Thanks.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from you, maybe some socio-ecological bioregional thing, right? What do you think about bioregions as an example of? I feel like that's what you're trying to get at, but including the human aspect too.
Absolutely. In the Amazon right now, there is a process called the Sacred Headwaters, Amazonian Sacred Headwaters Initiative, by 20 or 30 indigenous nations and some groups involved with them across the current national border between Peru and Ecuador, and saying this 30 million hectares of the Amazon, with all these indigenous nations in them and all the wildlife and everything, should be governed as one unit, right? And dissolve the political boundary between Peru and Ecuador, which makes no sense, no ecological sense anyway. So yeah, that's exactly what I'm aiming at.
Thanks so much. When Delaney is asking, I love your challenge of the idea of scaling up. Can you give us an example of an idea that worked in one place and then is spread to others using the horizontal linking you described?
Absolutely. So I'll give you the example from India, where which I'm most familiar with. So we have a movement which has started in a few pockets for bringing back what we call millets. Millets are ancient grains in India and many other parts of the world, including Africa and Europe, which got wiped out or displaced because of the imposition of wheat and rice with the Green Revolution in many parts of the world. So these are movements that are trying to bring back a diversity of local seeds of millets or local rice varieties and so on. That started with a few small movements in different parts of India, started networking with each other, became something called the Millet Network of India, which is putting pressure both for policy shifts, so that actually much more policy support can be given to millets, but also the mutual sharing and learning of experiences, so that many more farmers groups can actually take up these kinds of agroecological practices, and then creating the national network for that larger scale change, both on the ground, but also at the policy level. So that's an example, but there are similar things happening in many other sort of sectors of life.
I really appreciate that example. I have another question. How do we prevent local governments from implementing antiquated or draconian laws, as we're seeing in the United States with the illegalization of abortion now being decided by state governments?
Absolutely. I think this is crucial. So that's why one of those 5 spheres or petals in the flower of transformations is social justice. And so I mentioned that the struggles for gender justice for sexualities, for against casteism in India, against racism in so many parts of the world, have to be as much a part of the transformations as local governance and local economic democracy, etc. Without that, it will be very, very incomplete. And this means, therefore, that we need those larger level exchanges and relationships also. It cannot be a local community isolated and in itself. It has to also be those, connected to the larger kinds of transformations and changes we need. And in the short run, it might well mean that maybe even some government policies and laws that are for, let's say, in your case, you mentioned abortion, right? So it could be that, or other sorts of women's rights or feminist rights or against racism. There have been positive movements there in government policy or in United Nations international agreements. So those could also be tools, but in the long run, it would have to be that kind of ethical changes and transformations in people and in communities to enable this to sustain for a long run, because you cannot simply use a policy unless people are also ready for it. So I take that what your remark or your question as a very important caution against very simplistic arguments for localization or local democracy. We cannot have that only. We have to also have that with social justice struggles.
Yes, I agree with you. It's all about social justice ultimately, and how do we can sustain that in the long term by not undermining our ecological foundation, right? So we have here somebody saying, thank you for your incredibly moving talk. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how movements such as that of the Dalit women, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, that you mentioned, build their visions of the type of social arrangements they want.
Yes, so this is, I mean, I think especially Dalit women, because as I said, they're challenging two forms of discrimination, casteism and also patriarchy. And so their vision of the world is where, firstly, that the caste system itself is demolished and abolished because it doesn't have a place in any kind of progressive society, and that women are equal to men, but not equal in a very mechanistic sense. There are differences between different sexes and sexualities, right? But those differences should not be hierarchical of inequality. So they recognize, for instance, that women work much more with the earth or with forests or with seeds, and they have that special knowledge which men don't have. It's a difference. It doesn't mean that there's inequality between the two. And so their vision is of a world where we will live in peace with the earth. We will continue some of our traditional occupations, but we'll also experiment with some modern ones. So for instance, they have what we can call hybrid economies or hybrid societies, traditional knowledge, modern knowledge put together in a integrated way. Agriculture going along with, let's say, home-based homestays or home-based tourism that is run by the community, so that people from outside can come and also experience that life, right? And so they learn from each other. So they're not saying complete no to modern technology, or others are not saying complete no to traditional knowledge and technologies, but sort of what are the hybrid systems where both people are benefiting and nature is being protected. And it's not hybrid systems that are controlled by corporations and the government. If you look at pharmaceuticals, for instance, today, all the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, including all of those who benefited in the COVID pandemic, have stolen a lot of the traditional knowledge. They have combined that with modern knowledge, and they're basically using that for profit making, right? What these communities and movements are saying, yes, knowledge systems are good, but insofar as they will be under our control and for people's benefit and working with nature rather than for profit making and destruction. So that's the kind of thing that, the sorts of sort of approaches that are emerging from these fantastic initiatives on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for that. We might be running out of time soon, but I'll ask this other question here that I think is very important. How to decolonize our minds from the destructive influence of the global north? Parentheses, development, meaning growth, and now well-being, when vivir, the right to protect extractive property rights versus rights of nature. That's the first question. How do we decolonize our minds from the destructive influence of the global north?
Well, I guess the question there is, who's the we? So If it's people from the global north, I think, like I mentioned earlier when I was speaking about the sort of sometimes patronizing attitude that people in the global north have towards the global south, is that we need to firstly question that itself, right? Because that's part of the colonial attitude that, yeah, I want to help, rather than saying, can I transform myself, which will then actually automatically sometimes become help for the global south, because I will be leaving ecological space or climate space for them. And so I think that's one of the first and crucial things. There's lots of other things that are part of decolonization. If you may have noticed, the map that I used of the world when I was showing those examples of radical alternatives all over the world was a map that whenever I show it, people say, why is this upside down? And I have to explain that, look, if the earth is round and you're looking at it from space, it depends on what angle you're looking at it, whether you see Africa on top or Europe on top, right? The maps that we're used to are all colonial time maps. And to decolonize our mind, we have to also decolonize cartography, for instance. We have to decolonize languages and the imposition or the hegemony of English or other colonial languages. If you look at, for instance, even now when Zoom calls happen all over the world, we get translations into Spanish and French and English. We never get them in the 3,000 indigenous languages over the world, etc. So there's many different ways in which decolonization has to happen. We have to ask ourselves, what is the context in which we are working, and how have we been colonized? What is the kind of learning we've had which is part of colonial traditions, and how do we unlearn that? How do we build relationships with people from the global south where they are expressing their own agency and political action, etc., and learn from that and say, okay, how does this question my own upbringing or my own lifestyle, my own consumption, my own ways of thinking and doing, and through that actually be able to decolonize ourselves. Which also means that huge changes in educational system, all our educational systems across the world, I mean, in India, for instance, we suffer that, are extremely colonial in many, many different ways, right? So even challenging curriculum, challenging the ways in which we learn and teach each other are all part of this decolonization. And I'm glad to say that either as part of the global tapestry or otherwise, there are now many, many movements which are trying to do this kind of decolonization of pedagogies and epistemologies, or the decolonization of cartography, this indigenous cartography, for instance, and many others that are doing this kind of decolonization.
And just to be fair, since we ran a little bit late, I'll ask one more question here. I saw that many of the slides included a floral spiral motif. Could you please speak about the symbolism behind that?
Well, I mean, this is used, these motifs are used in a lot of indigenous peoples or other local communities around the world. And there's actually striking similarity very often in these motifs. And I think the idea, there are many, many things. I don't have the time. I see that Kate is already here. I don't want to impinge on her time. Is that, modern Western civilization has thought of time as being linear. So you have past, present, and future in one very neat line. And that's how also this whole nonsensical notion of developed notions and nations and developing nations, etc., has built up, or what is higher status and lower status, etc. Whereas actually indigenous peoples or other local communities have had a different sense of time, circular or spiral. Spiral means that you are going around in circles, but you're not necessarily coming back to exactly the same point. You're sort of also evolving in different ways, but it's also going back to the past and coming to the present and the future, and they're kind of merging together in very interesting forms. This is a very complex, deep philosophical thing also, so obviously we don't have the time to get into it. I don't even fully understand it myself, but the idea of the spiral is essentially that we have to continuously learn from the past, present, future, from each other, and then keep evolving in different ways. So we're not stuck at any one place, nor are we thinking of ourselves as just a unilinear sort of line in time and space and economy and so on.
Thank you so much. I think you're talking about the dynamics of everything. And I just wanted to really thank you again, because I know you're in Indian time, and you just being here today is incredible. It's an honor for all of us to have you. I believe we learned so much from you. And I believe we will continue to learn if everyone reads the post-development dictionary. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And you can stay if you want to.
I will hang on a bit to hear Kate. Hi, Kate. And Over to you. Thanks a lot.
So I would like to welcome Kay Raworth. Hi, Kay Raworth.
Hi.
Thank you for being with us. And I don't know if you have a presentation that you want to share, or we can give people a couple of minutes. Yeah, let's give you a break because it's been an hour. So, yep, an awkward pause, like we say in the US.
Let's make it a comfortable pause.
Yes, let's make it a fun pause. I recommend everyone to stretch, and you can stand up, just take a deep breath after everything you heard from Ashish, and reflect on how beautiful the world is and how diverse it is. He talked about all this diversity that we're not used to hearing about, and it's just really rich, and we're grateful for him for that. So I guess we gave you enough time. Please let us know on the chat where you guys are from and what's going on with you. I'm gonna probably hand it over to, well, I have to introduce Kate first. First to also thank you, because I believe it's night or it's getting dark. It's already dark probably in the United Kingdom. So, but just thank you for agreeing to come to present to us and to teach us about the donut economics. See what we can learn in the everywhere to try to draw and moving from theory to practice, like you say, right? Do you have a presentation to share, or?
Yes, I do, and I'm so sorry I wasn't able to join and hear Ashish. I would have loved to be part of that conversation, but I'm sitting in a office, manager's office in a community centre in Birmingham, because I've been here with a community centre, a community group putting donut economics into action here in Birmingham today. So it feels like a very fitting place to be, to talk about putting these ideas in practice. So I didn't blur my background. I thought, yeah, this is where I am. This is where I am. And I do have some slides I'd love to show. So if I just share my screen.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I've been following your Twitter, and you are all over the place outside, which is so fun, talking about donut economics.
Great. So it's great to join you. I'm Kate Raworth. Quick background to what brings me here. I studied economics at university in the 1990s because I wanted to learn the language, the mother tongue of public policy, and I very quickly got really frustrated. Couldn't quite name what it was that was frustrating me, like the experience of so many economics students, because you're only taught one view, you're only taught one perspective, and you're not even taught that there is another. That's the key. This is economics, this is it, these are the frames. And so much of what I cared about, environmental integrity, social justice, it just was missing from the frames, and I never wanted to introduce myself as an economist. So I walked away from economics, and then I worked over many years, found myself always begging economics to make space to recognize social and environmental issues from the outside, and eventually found myself as part of what I consider a very big team, and many people in this call, I'd say, part of that big team internationally, saying, let's rewrite economics, let's make it fit for the future. So I'm going to talk about where I came from this, very much looking at economics from a Western industrial mindset of the economic framing that I was taught, rewriting that for the future. So let me kick off with the 20th century economics that I was taught, and I'm going to guess many people that brought many people here into this conversation may also have been taught or learned or imbibed, even if you never studied economics, it somehow becomes the water we swim in. So for me, three key concepts of 20th century economics. The first image that's taught in universities around the world, you know it already, it's supply and demand. And that puts the market at the center of our vision from day one. Welcome to economics, the art of household management. Here is the market. Very, very specific and political move, I would say, to immediately position the market as the central first concept. Of course, what it does is put price at the center of our vision. It becomes the metric of concern, and anything that falls outside the price contract we are taught to call an externality. So we find ourselves in the absurd situation of talking about the death of the living world as an environmental externality. And for me, that was a reason alone enough to say this framing doesn't work. The selfie of humanity, rational economic man, he's never drawn, but I drew him like this: a man with money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. That is who we're told we are. And the more that university students learn about this character, the more they start to emulate him and admire him, the more they want to be competitive and individualistic rather than collaborative and altruistic. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we will become. And then the goal. Of course, the goal is so deep, it's never explicitly addressed or questioned, but it is the goal of endless economic growth. It underlies every textbook, every mainstream textbook. And students, I always see them drop their jaw when they realize that they never even questioned this. They were never invited to ask if there was any other goal, or if this could be possible or should be possible or is always desirable. So I think these concepts that certainly permeated my education, many people's education, they have a huge responsibility for what they put at the center of our vision, what they leave invisible. What they tell us is, you know, made visible on the page and what's left off. So I think they brought us to the context of many crises that we now find ourselves facing, whether it was financial meltdown of the crisis in 2008, the ongoing era of climate and ecological breakdown, the COVID lockdown. All of these crises hit with huge inequalities of gender and race, of wealth and power between the global north and the global south. But they tell us how connected we are with each other and the rest of the living world. And they arise from the very systems we've created. I believe they arise from systems that are built upon the presumption of endless expansion and endless growth. Whether it's a financial system aiming to endlessly expand, it creates its own bubble and collapses. Our endless use of fossil fuels and Earth's materials induce climate and ecological breakdown, and humanity endlessly expanding into areas of wildlife coupled with global travel create perfect conditions for a global health pandemic. So how do we move away from the deep metaphor that progress is endless expansion or indeed endless economic growth according to GDP? I think one of the profound ways we do that is by redrawing the images, by shifting our mindsets and using verbal framing, changing our words, but also changing the images. And I learned this only through doing. I learned this by doodling a diagram that looks like a donut that had way more impact in people's language, in the way they advocated, and in the confidence with which they spoke from a new frame than I had ever imagined. So to get away from this 20th century expansionist and crisis-inducing mindset, I'm going to start again, not with supply and demand. Let's start with the vision of a goal that we want to aim for. And here's one version of that goal, not the only version, but one version, and it looks like a donut. So the goal here, if we think of humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of this picture, we want to leave no one in the hole, falling short on the essentials of life, without overshooting the life-supporting systems of our planetary home. So meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And that means that the shape of progress isn't endless growth, it's thriving in dynamic balance, human and planetary, and the more than human thriving together. What would it look like simply to even aim for that? And we could bring this as a goal, and you may say you disagree or you want to change something to it. Fantastic, let's debate, but at least we're actually having an explicit conversation about what we aim for. Because if we haven't had that conversation, how on earth can we know what success looks like? That's where the absence of this conversation leads us to just to think economic growth is going to deliver. And we know it's actually been so tightly correlated with many things that are destructive. So if this is one version of a goal, And I caught the tail end of the conversation there with Ashish about diagrams from indigenous communities. I was really struck when I looked at this image and thought, well, how have indigenous societies envisioned, visually shown images of well-being and health and thriving? And from the Taoist yin yang to the Buddhist endless knot to the Maori takarangi to the Celtic double spiral, so many images have this sense of a dynamic whole roundness. There's something that's deep within those traditions and wisdoms in indigenous societies that the Western culture is such an outlier. Western society thought that the shape of progress is an ever rising line of growth. How can we learn from those other cultures, but also create our own insights? You can't just co-opt and adopt another culture's worldview and cosmology. You need to create and reimagine and narrate one that makes sense from your own history, decolonizing it and reimagining and reinventing it. And I hope that the concept of donut economics contribute towards that as part of a much bigger picture. So if the goal is this thriving imbalance in the donut, the challenge, of course, is we're way out of that right now. Millions, billions of people fall short on the essentials of life in countries, low-income countries, and I could go out in the streets of Birmingham or Oxford or London or New York or cities and find deprivation in the midst of plenty. We know that. There is a global south in the midst of the global north. Billions of people falling short on meeting their essential needs, and we are already overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. So we are outside on both sides of this. And this is the turnaround point, because this is, I'd say, humanity's collective selfie. We're the first generation to see this visualization with data. This is our context. What do you do once that you know? How do we turn this story around? How do we ensure that the way we create new economic theories, new policies, new business models, new ways of lifestyles and community living, we need to reinvent those, because last century's theories and models and policies weren't at all invented to solve for this. They were invented on the presumption that endless expansion will take us to where we want to go. We need to come up with new. That's hugely overwhelming. It's also incredibly exciting, depending on your mindset, your moment, and your perspective. So how do we turn this story around and bring humanity into the donut from both sides at the same time? I'm showing you a global donut of the whole world at the same time, but of course, much policy making happens much closer to home at the level of nations. So here's 4 nations. We've got Malawi, huge human deprivation visible there without overshooting their pressure on the planet. China, a double whammy of human shortfall and ecological overshoot. Spain, another country, still human shortfall and some overshoot. And then here, Australia, I could have shown you Canada or the US, countries that force all other countries to be shown so small because their overshoot is so big, they're pushing others off the page. What we can see here is countries in very different positions in relation to this. And the red overshoot is a consumption basis. It's not emissions and consumption use within their nations, it's their global consumption footprint. And that must come back within. Let me take these 4 and then put them in a plot of about 60 countries. The sweet spot is where that little green donut is in the top left-hand corner, where you meet the needs of all people, but you do it within the means of the living planet. And what you can see immediately is that there's no country known that is yet living in the donut. Countries that are the closest, Costa Rica, got Mauritius, Jordan around there. Look at the outlying high-income countries, the US, Canada, Australia, massive overshoot that they need to come back within. Low-income countries needing to meet people's needs for the first time without overshooting planetary boundaries in the way that all that have gone before them have done. And middle-income countries with the double whammy challenge of meeting people's needs for the first time were already coming back within planetary boundaries. And then we know that these countries' histories and futures aren't separated like dots on the page. They are deeply interconnected through histories of colonialism, through military power, through trade and finance rules, through resource extraction, through the current and future impacts of climate change. So we need transformation within and between nations. How do we get there? Going to the heart of donut economics, I would say it depends upon 2 huge dynamics that need to be transformed. We need to move away from the linear degenerative economies we've inherited, taking Earth's materials, making it into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away. That pushes us over planetary boundaries. We need to go from degenerative to regenerative so that resources are used again and again, far more carefully, collectively, creatively, and slowly. What might that look like? a couple of examples from around the world, from landscape degradation to restoration, and just think how it actually feels to us to see those very contrasting images. How do we no longer destroy the sources of our sustenance in the way that we live, but actually regenerate them and bring back and restore and protect the living world? And then in our manufacturing and our technical use of materials, no longer linear manufacturing that dumps waste in the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people, but creates a circular economy where we share and repair and refurbish and remanufacture using and mining materials again and again, a very different design. So from degenerative to regenerative, and I'm sure you can imagine many, many other examples that could be brought here of that transformation. Adding to this, we've inherited economies that tend to be divisive by design, capturing value and opportunity in the hands of a few, whether it's within or between nations, due to infrastructure, due to historical ownership and creation of assets and power, due to inheritance and privilege, regulation that reinforces that loop. How do we, I mean, we'll never get into the donut if we continue to create systems that capture value and opportunity in the hands of a few and leave the majority without. We need to create economies that are distributive in their very design. So I'm not talking about having an unequal economy and redistributing after tax. Of course, tax redistribution is important, but can we go deeper and actually pre-distribute the sources of wealth creation so that economies create distributive dynamics in their very operations? We share value and opportunity with all who co-create it. That turns out to be the whole of society. What might that look like? I'm just going to give, again, two examples from many cities around the world, including cities in which I've lived and grown up, London, Oxford. Housing and rent crises, where housing comes to be treated as an investment asset for those with luxury, accumulated wealth, investing to get that return, when actually housing is a human right. The city of Vienna, shown on the right here, recognized housing as a human right many decades ago. And so the majority of people, over 60% of people in that city, live in housing that is social housing, in the sense it's owned by the city or by city-owned cooperatives. It's affordable, it's normal, it's central. It's a completely different approach to the ownership and use of housing to meet human needs rather than as a speculative investment asset. And then I'm showing also very different designs of business. We've inherited a mindset that says, well, Milton Friedman told us, you know, the business of business is business. It's driven by profits. That's the design. That's the nature of business. There's nothing natural about that. Business doesn't have a nature. It's a design. It's a choice. We can actually design purpose-led businesses that are driven by, for example, in this one in Mumbai, the intention of creating value for those who are the employees and those who run and work the business themselves. So we can redesign housing, we can redesign business to be far more distributive by design. And I imagine you can think of many, many more examples that we could show this contrast. And I think it's really important to show the contrast so we see what we're so familiar with that we've taken for granted, but we can see it's actually divisive in its design. And here's an alternative. It is possible. Different places are actually already doing it. So from degenerative to regenerative, divisive to distributive. These are just some of the core ideas that I set out in the book of Donut Economics. What struck me when it came out in 2017 was people said, yes, I like the book and I'm teaching it in my classroom, or I'm putting it into practice in my city, or I'm taking it into my community group, I'm taking it to my town council meeting, I'm bringing it into my social enterprise. And it became clear people actually wanted to do this. So I and others set up Donut Economics Action Lab. There's an online website. I really invite you to come and explore it and join it, to ask ourselves, well, how do we do this? None of us have done this before. We don't know how to turn these ideas into practice, but we're an action lab with great intention. Action because it's all about the action and the practice. It's a lab because this is one big experiment and we're all collectively learning. How do we put these designs into practice? So I'm going to just share with you the work we've been doing around cities. So we say, we're asked again and again, can our city live in the donut? What would it mean to do it here in our town or city or neighborhood or district or rural community or our state or our nation or our island? So I'm saying city, but think of a place that makes sense to you wherever you are. Is it a town or a city or a nation or a state? How can your city help bring humanity into the donut? And we ask that instead of saying, how can your city live in the donut? Because we're so interconnected. I don't think any one place can do it until we all do it. But we can certainly take steps as pioneers to strongly drive ourselves in the direction and help others move there too. So if we want to do this, we need to unroll the donut, open out that space so we can go inside and make a space for ourselves between that social foundation and the ecological ceiling. So there's a space for imagining, reflecting, dreaming, reinventing. It becomes a canvas for reimagining the future. And we make tools that are really practical so that everybody feels they can be involved. They're very friendly, jargon, low jargon use, and we want them to be irresistible. So that in places like where I am today, communities say, yep, this is for me, and this makes me feel like I'm involved in reshaping the economy, because I am. So we dive inside and we've got the space between the foundation and the ecological ceiling, and we invite this question in any place that wants to ask it. How can our city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? That's a complex question, so we can break it out into these 4 lenses. And on the one side, you've got the local aspirations of a place, and we've got the global responsibilities. So the local aspirations to be thriving people here, all the people of this place thriving while being ecologically generous, and I'll talk more about that. But we also put that in the context of recognizing that every place is deeply interconnected with the rest of the living world and with humanity worldwide. We depend upon and influence the lives and the ecosystems of other places. So we have a responsibility to live well here while respecting their rights there. Let's dive inside, starting with how can all the people of our city thrive? What would it mean for everybody in your place to have good food and clean water, healthcare, education, housing, transport, culture, community, political voice, decent income, justice and peace, sense of equality in our diversity, whatever our background, that we have voice and are recognized and respected? These are the dimensions of the social foundation. What does it mean for everybody here to have it, whether their families lived here for centuries or they arrived and became a member of this community last year? How do we bring our cultural values to achieving this? And this is, of course, a very rich conversation in every place. And the answer will be different in Dar es Salaam than in Dubai, than in Dhaka, than in Berlin or Barcelona. So add to that, on the local side, this question: how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? And this question comes from the biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus. She would say, wherever you are, she'd say, take me to the wildland next door, take me to the place at the nearby healthy ecosystem of your place where nature is really thriving. It's not going to be completely wild because there are almost no wildlands left, but a healthy nature next door. Because nature has a generosity in every place, everywhere on earth, whether it's in the tropics or a temperate forest, whether it's up a mountain or in a valley or wetlands or on the coast. Nature has figured out there how to cleanse the air and house biodiversity and wildlife, how to store carbon, cycle the water, harvest energy, regulate the temperature, build soil, and make us feel at home. So how can we take that generosity of the living world? Some people call it ecosystem services. I prefer much to think of it as the generosity of the way nature reproduces and creates conditions conducive to life. How can we take that idea and use it to inspire the design of our cities and places? Can our city, from the forest treetops to the forest floor, the trees can cool the temperature by about 10 degrees. And yet we all know that in a hot day in a city, you can be really hit by the urban heat island effect. How can we emulate the coolness of the forest in our cities? Is it by planting trees and having a canopy across the street? Is it by hoisting up canvas canopies, by building narrow alleys? How can we emulate nature's generosity here in the way we bring back wildlife, in the way we store carbon in our buildings, in the way we collect water after a storm and store it in tanks under the street? How do we make permeable pavement? So these ideas are the local aspirations of a place. And you can imagine, I can think of many places that are actually incredibly proud, often in Scandinavia, oh yes, it's great life for people here, and we have beautiful nature, and the harbor's clean, and the air's clean, and the forest's clean. Great, but this is only half the story, because we also have to take account of the way that we live here having impacts on people worldwide. So let's think about how could we respect the health of the whole planet. Let's think of, for example, where our clothes came from, where our food came from, all the electronics that we're using to communicate right now, all of the construction materials that went into building this room I'm sitting in right now, and all of our cities, they have been imported from all over the world. So we need to take account of our virtual global footprint, materially and energetically. because we know that land has been converted. We know that there are waste dumps, streams of waste. How can we come back within those planetary boundaries? That red overshoot, this is that lens. How do we come back within those planetary boundaries? Transform the way we travel and heat and consume. And this is where we need to create a circular economy. And then add to this, not only thinking about our global ecological connections, but our global social connections with people worldwide, who stitched and sewed the clothes we wear, who picked and packed the food we eat, who assembled your phones and laptops, who dug and transported the minerals and materials that make the buildings we live in. Global supply chains and the labor conditions within them is one really obvious way in which we're all connected to the rest of the living world and humanity. But also the current and future impacts of climate breakdown. I've been, like I'm sure many of you, thinking of people in India, Pakistan, who have been facing temperatures of 50 degrees in recent months. That is clearly a sign of climate change that we know has been initiated and triggered and has historical responsibility in the global north. How do we think about and respond to that responsibility for creating those impacts now? And when this triggers refugees, when people come and move to where you are, how are they welcomed or not? What is the official policy? What is the culture of welcome? When we think about how, for example, many cities in the global north, many people who are coming from immigrant communities are sending remittances home, an amazingly powerful way to redistribute resources from a high-income city in the global north to families worldwide. How can places enable that? How can they use their universities and sports and arts to build contacts, culture, solidarity, empathy, connection between peoples? So I'm giving you just ideas across these 4 lenses. And as you can imagine, you can engage with them in many ways. If I just take away that specificity, you can imagine bringing any issue you care about to the center here. You could put your city's food system or transport system or the concept of the circular economy here at the center and ask, how does it show up in all of these 4 lenses? And what can we do to bring ourselves into the donut in all 4 of these lenses? How much else can we do? And how can we design in ways that will do these together rather than seeing them in tension with one another? And we invite places that are engaging and really creating a city portrait through this, is to say for each of these lenses, what's our target or commitment? Many cities have already got targets that map quite closely onto many of these goals: cutting carbon emissions, targets on health, on cutting poverty, on having clean air locally. So what is the city's existing target? And is it ambitious enough? How are we doing? What's the data that we can collect to ask ourselves, how are we doing now in relation to that? Are we collecting the data we need? And where there are no data, can we get a sense, or how can we use people's science to connect and collect that information so that it's not just left blank, but actually we make visible people's lived experience of place? What positive initiatives are already underway? Let's celebrate what's happening. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by the gap, let's also celebrate what's already underway and what else and what more can that inspire here and elsewhere. And what must we now do? How can we make it happen? How can we bring ourselves into this space? So some examples. We began this work in Portland, in Philadelphia, and Amsterdam in 2019, before COVID. Nobody had heard of coronavirus. We began working with city policymakers and communities in these 3 cities in connection with the C40 initiative. And this was really exciting to see city policymakers sitting down around this framework and looking at their places through the 4 lenses. What they told us was, it's such a relief to step out of my silo, whether my silo is tackling inequality or education or waterways or tree cover or transport. I want to connect and have a holistic view, because we're never going to solve these things when we do it one at a time. We're finding that we've actually been approached by cities and places and towns around the world, and everything that's showing up here are places that have connected with us. So one of our policies and principles of the way we work at Donut Economics Action Lab is we go where the energy is. We're a tiny team of 9 people. And so we've never once pushed or lobbied or tried to persuade anybody to use these tools. We believe that change makers who know how to use them are based in their own locality, in their own context. They will be the judges of saying, you know what, given what's going on here and how we're working, these tools would actually be really useful to help bring about the transformation we already want to make. So what you're seeing on the map are places where people have got in touch with us and said, in one way or another, we want to start using these tools to transform our own place and our own future. And I'm just going to share with you a couple of examples of places that are beginning to put this into practice. And I'm going to say right at the start, this is only just beginning. So I can't tell you of a place that has done it and what difference did it make, and it's done and dusted. It's just beginning as we emerge from this COVID crisis. And it's very hard for any one place to do it because they're embedded in a state, in a nation, in a region, in the world. So you've got this place that's trying to create an island of transformation in a sea of stasis. And as anyone would know, that's very challenging. And yet we must begin, and they do. So Amsterdam was the first city to say we want to use the donut as an overarching concept in our creation of a circular economy here in our city. And they came up with this concept of having a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. I would love all cities, at least in the global north now, to start. I mean, I think there's no excuse for any city in the global north. Why are they not already committing to that? And of course, all cities worldwide and all settlements to be moving towards this vision of what it means to thrive. Amsterdam brought this concept into their circular policy, started looking at how they could refurbish housing and make that social and refurbished circular low carbon housing, bringing it into the supply chain of clothing. Amsterdam's actually the center for denim production and reuse. Who knew? So they want to be not Silicon Valley, but Textile Valley, and having a denim circularity. And how can these companies work together to create much more circularity in the use of denim? And then working with local farmers and local communities to make sure that excess produce during coronavirus was going to families who really needed that nutrition and that support. So these are just some examples of the policies the city started to put into practice. And then in Amsterdam, at the same time, many change makers and networks of change makers said, we want to use this concept. They created the Amsterdam Donut Coalition as a group of change makers and are building year-on-year meetings and meetups to celebrate what's in action and to ask how we're moving and holding the city to account in some ways of saying, well, you adopted this concept, now what? How far have we gone? What's going on? Another city is in Nanaimo in Canada. First city, I would say, actually in North America that got in touch was the city policymakers, councillors in the city that said, we want to actually use this concept in our own transformation. So they made their own version of the donut, adapting it. And this is and we invite adaptation as long as it holds the core integrity. Adapt it to your place, because there's nothing worse than something that's imposed top down. It's like this. Adapt it to make sense of it. And we're learning as they go. And they're using this framework to now compare alternative scenarios, as you can see here, for the future of mobility. And 3 scenarios, and how do they affect the social and ecological ambition that's captured here in the donut? What's transformative, and we've heard from the councillors there, is saying, well, we used to always be focused on these cost benefit analyses, and we used to be focused on, is this bringing growth? And this gives us just a different compass, a different goal. It shifts the conversation, and therefore it shifts decision making around what we actually want to be taking into account when we're bringing about new infrastructure and making transformational policies. The capital region of Brussels and Belgium have also taken the concept, and they made this really beautiful 4 lenses you can see, using cartoon and images to make it accessible to everybody. And they've tried using the concepts at the macro, meso, micro, and nano levels, all the way from city and regional policy making right down to the household and the use of a single object. And the woman holding a big sign, leave no one in the hole, she's Barbara Tracht. She's the Secretary of State for Economic and Ecological Transition in the capital region. She's the policymaker who's really brought these ideas in and is seeking to embed it in the thinking. So again, it's a mind shift change. Rather than a specific policy, it starts with, this is the vision of where we want to go. How does that now start to reshape everything that we do? And you can see people get playful. They made some global donuts and start handing them out in the streets of Brussels, lobbying the European community at the same time. So let me come to Barcelona, another place where the city has said, we're going to do this. They've really dived in, and you can see that on-rolled donut, and they've started gathering the metrics on either side, exploring it through data, exploring it through community, and getting a sense of people's sense of where are we falling short, where are we in overshoot, and how does that map onto the data that we have, and how then can we start to transform? And then I'll end with a slide from the very place I'm sitting right now, Birmingham. One of the places I actually feel most proud to be connected to and speak of in the UK. There's a lot of things we're not so proud of in the UK right now. I'll just leave it like that. You can probably guess a few. But this I'm really proud to be connected to. Amazing organization called Civic Square in Birmingham, working at the level of a neighborhood called Ladywood, Portloop, in the city, traditionally underserved community, They're based here and they're going street by street, house by house. Today, there was a festival inviting people to come along and explore what would it mean to look at their neighborhood through these very four lenses of the donut that I've just talked through. They put on a lot of games to engage kids. And of course, the kids just get it really quickly because it makes sense to them really quickly. But it's about making it very accessible to everybody in a very clear, simple, playful language. So we make it full of art, we make it irresistible because economic conversation belongs to everybody. So in all of these places, and this is the last big idea I want to share, in all of these places, people come back and say, you know, if we're really going to transform, we need to really transform the deep design of our very institutions, because we've inherited institutions, and we heard this first in Amsterdam. We've inherited institutions. We were actually told as policymakers to focus on this question: how can we make our city grow? But you know what? When we aim for that, we so often end up making it divisive and degenerative. And there comes all those problems. How we want to shift. We don't want to be asking that question anymore. We want to ask, how can we make our city thrive? Because we actually want to make it regenerative. We want to make it distributive. But the institutions we've inherited don't actually allow us to do that. How can we shift? So what are the deep design, the layers of design that enable us to move from how do we grow to how do we thrive? We think there are 5 of them, and they are hugely inspired for me by the work of Marjorie Kelly. You may know her. She's a brilliant analyst and a sort of 21st century new enterprise designer based in the US, working with the Democracy Collaborative. So she came up with these 5 design traits that really influenced me when I was writing donut economics. Purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. Let me talk you through when we bring these ideas to the city. So a city that's in service of being a thriving city. What's your purpose? Do you have a big vision like this one of Amsterdam? Do you have high ambition like in Oslo, where they've really set themselves a high ambition to decarbonize fast? What is the purpose of a place? Is that vision shared? Does it really drive what's going on? So without purpose, we will probably drift back to growth. What is that clear vision of the place we want to become? Networks. So networks meaning all of the relationships. What are the relationships we want to build? Can we build new relationships with citizens and residents in the place through deliberative democracy? Can we build new circular networks, right? Industries that actually work together because the waste from one process becomes food for the next. So creating a circular city scan, for example, is one way of finding the connections between the food and beverage industries, the plastics, the metals, the natural fibers. So the industry starts to work in new networks. Networks across levels. So like in Ghent, they connected all the stakeholders who had a stake in the food system and started working together. And equally as important as saying, what are the new networks and relationships we need to build? Also, what are the ones we need to let go of, leave behind? What are the old lobby pressures, the vested interests that don't serve us to move to this future? How can we actually just let them go because they are pulling us back? Governance, how are places governed? So many different ways we could think about this, but just very briefly, how do we govern for transformation? 3 examples. Oslo decided in that ambition to cut carbon emissions, they're going to budget their carbon budget like finance. So every year when they issue their financial budget to different departments, they also issue a carbon budget, just ratcheting it down. Amsterdam has really ambitious regulations on creating circularity. 100% circular by 2050, great, quite far away. 50% circular by 2030, that's their goal. So less than a decade, half of the materials in use in that city should be circular, and 10% circularity in government procurement contracts this year. From the end of this year, so I'm going to be knocking on the door. Okay, Amsterdam, have you achieved 10% circularity in your procurement? Because that creates opportunity for the front runners now. And then experimentation, as many of us have saw what happened, witnessed what happened in Stockton in California. They guaranteed basic income. Experiment for 18 months for low-income families, giving them around $500 a month to spend on what they needed to spend it on, and monitoring what happens. People said, oh, it won't work, and people will be lazy and they'll waste the money. No, they didn't. They used it to actually invest in what they needed. They used it to get themselves out of a poverty trap, to get to that job interview, to take a risk you can't take when you are so vulnerable. So this kind of policy experimentation at the level of cities, of course, has an impact way above the city. The world is watching, nations are watching, regions are watching. Cities experimentation actually gives us that opportunity to bring in new possibilities that nations will never be the first to jump to. Going deeper, how is the sources of wealth creation owned in a place? Who owns the land and housing? I told you the story in Vienna, that makes all the difference. In Paris, the water supply was privatized in the 1980s when everything was being privatized. And then they realized, well, we don't control the water, which is so crucial to the security of our futures in the face of climate change. And we're not getting the revenue from it. So they've now brought it back under public control and actually taking care of protecting the water and benefiting from the public money that that water raises. Who controls the data? Is it going to be surveillance capitalism or actually data sovereignty? In Barcelona is one city that's committed to saying open data, participation, sovereignty. Who controls the businesses? The city of Atlanta in the US has way more Black-owned enterprises than many cities around. Why? Because they really work to make it happen, knowing that who owns business profoundly shapes whose communities and families benefit from business ownership. Enterprise does not have to be extractive. It can be local community wealth building. So how can we create policies that ensure that these very sources of wealth creation are owned and shared locally, redistributing and distributing that wealth? Lastly, down to finance, because it sits at the bottom, because it sits deepest and it shapes everything. How can the city harness its policy making and finance budgeting cycle to purpose finance towards these goals? How can it use the power of procurement, as has happened in Cleveland, Ohio, as has happened in Preston in the UK, procuring from local community enterprises, buying from those who are already exemplifying the values that we want to see in practice? How do we divest city pension funds, for example, from fossil fuels and steer them towards the future we want? So many, many conversations around finance. So let me pull out and say, we invite cities, any city that wants to explore the donut, we say, well, let's go here now. Let's look at your deep design, the layers of design that determine whether you're pulled back into that divisive and degenerative economy, or you can become regenerative and distributive. Asking what in the city's design still holds you back, and what already drives us forward? What can we stop, let go of, and leave behind? What can we start, spread, and amplify? But also let's recognize, of course, that every place is embedded in a nation, in a region like European Union, embedded in the world. So what in that wider context still holds us back? And there's going to be a lot of things there that no one city alone can tackle. But when we make new networks, we can begin as allies to start putting pressure for that to change as well. We've used this framework in cities like Amsterdam, in person, in Toronto online, and we're very soon going to be publishing this as one of our many online tools, so that you could take it into your own community and use it to think about the deep design of your place, and what do we need to stop, let go of, and leave behind? What do we need to start, spread, and amplify? So let me pull back. If we're going to get into the donut, we need to become regenerative and distributive by design. And I've shared with you the 4 lenses of the city portrait, and this, what we call the powers to act, of how can we redesign our institutions so they're actually in service of getting into that space. So these are just some of the ways in relation to cities and places that we're using the tools and sharing the tools in the 21st Century Commons online. We put them into the Commons. We're a fully funded organization by foundation, so everything we're producing is for the Commons. We ask only for reciprocity, that people share back their experience of using these tools, and they share back their innovations, so that we collectively build far richer tools and we learn together. So I'm just going to end by saying, here are some of the books that really influenced me when I was writing donut economics, and since, just a small selection of many, many books that have been influential for me. And if you like the idea and the sound of Donut Economics Action Lab, I hugely welcome you, invite you to either join or just to browse if you'd rather have a look. We created it, as I said, because people just started getting playful with the donut in so many ways. It was clear they wanted to put it into practice. So we've got an online platform where we invite members to join and connect with people in their own region. We create tools, and we invite others to share their own created tools, and we invite people to share stories back of the tools that you've created, so that we collectively learn. There's nothing like the power of peer-to-peer inspiration and the power of peer-to-peer permission to get started and do, and to bring about the transformation. So I offer this as one of many approaches to putting new economic thinking into practice. We're learning as we go. It's an experiment. Is it going to work? I don't know. And this is how we learn. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kay, for this amazing presentation. And on top of all the work you're doing right now, you're literally boots on the ground trying to implement this, and it's just really exciting. And one of the things that I got away from your talk is just how inspiring this implementation effort is. It's almost like the dream come true for anyone who cares about ecological economics and just making society more equitable and sustainable. Count Burlington, Vermont as one of your cities coming up. And I believe, John Erickson, who is one of my advisors, and Josh Farley, who you know too. John, you said there is like we're doing something in Vermont coming up. John, yeah.
Yeah, Kate, we're working with the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, which is sort of a quasi-government group, and I've pitched to them the whole donut idea. And through a series of meetings earlier this year, they've adopted it as their kind of 3-year strategic plan. So we're going to do it. The hope is to engage with you all and do a donut for the state of Vermont, which is like a small city because we're only 620,000 people.
That's amazing news. That's just brilliant to hear. And I'd love to connect you with my colleague Leonora Kucheva. She's our cities and regions lead. So we ask for any place, and if there's anybody else online saying, oh, we are doing this in our place, we want to do this in our place, write to us through the contact form on our platform. It'll go, if you say cities, regions, places, it'll go straight to Leonora.
Okay.
First thing she'll do is say, let's get in touch, let's have a conversation. Oh, I can tell you it's what you're doing is, and the way you're getting started is like this city or that place. And we're holding webinars, inviting the policymakers, some of the people I've just been talking about, telling how they got started, because I know it's so inspiring for them to hear from other mayors, other councillors of how they can practice. But that's amazing news. I'm going to tweet.
Yeah, it started as a classroom exercise, and now it's elevated to a statewide initiative. So this is great news. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. That's amazing.
Thank you so much. And during the past 4 years, we have been trying to inspire everyone. I think this is a good culmination to have Kate inspire us and to find out ways to move from theory to action, which is what ultimately matters. So I'm gonna go try to get some of the questions from the participants, and they are very excited. They're asking a lot of questions. You can see them on the Q&A box. So somebody's asking, what is the optimal time to conduct donut and refresh the data to monitor the changes?
The optimal time, meaning when should we get started? Or
yeah, I believe so. They were not specific, so it will be up to your interpretation.
Well, the optimal time is probably 1972, isn't it?
Right.
But you know what? We're here now. So tonight, I think the optimal time is tonight. Well, I mean, I'm only half joking. So one of my great heroes, and I'm sure, and Josh, it's great to see you. Can I just say that, Josh, when we met, you came and met in my kitchen some years ago before I started writing this, but you so inspired me to do this work and telling me about your journey in your, what did you call your PhD? Not your indoctrination. Yes, it was your indoctrination. And it really inspired me. Like, actually, the route I'm going to take, I'm not going to do a PhD. I'm going to do this book because this where I live and the places that were on offer to me. If I do a PhD, I probably will get indoctrinated, and I like to try and fit in and try and belong. So thank you, and it's great to be here again with you.
I'm super honored if I influenced you in any way.
Oh, you so did. You so did. Donella Meadows, right? When she talks about paradigm change, she says paradigm change, you know, it's one of her highest leverage points. And she says it might sound weird because it might sound like it takes forever to do, but you know, and an individual can happen like that, falling from the scales from the eyes. And it's in the images, it's in the concepts, it's in the narrative. And I think it's also in the proof of practice. You know, I know showing images is one thing. Oh, look, some people when they see the donut, they go, yes, that's the picture I've been missing. Other people are like, yeah, it's a picture. It's when you say, oh, and here's a city and town and a neighborhood and a mayor and a council. They're like, damn, people are doing this. And so we get inspired and we give ourselves permission in different ways, but it's that paradigm change moment. So we can change our paradigms tonight, right? We can change it like that. The best way, so if you want to get started with these tools, I hugely invite you, please do get in touch with our team. We've got a cities and communities lead. We've got a business and enterprise lead. We've got a cities and regions lead. We've got a communities and arts lead. Anybody in a community organization, we're about to hire an education lead. So we want to, please get in touch. Please join the community, get in touch, tell us, because we want to learn with you and from you. We want to encourage you to write up your story. There's nothing like a story from a change maker to inspire 50 more.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And you talk about Donella Meadows. I've been pounding to everyone here every single day Donella Meadows' quotes and everything. The whole course and the Ecological Economics for All initiative, which this is part of, is based on her 5 tools for sustainability transition that she wrote in 1992. Everything she did was so relevant, and thank you so much for that. I was just gonna add to you, like, what we've been trying to do is give you this biophysical and social foundation from an ecological economic perspective, and how we can draw from the heterodox economic schools to understand what is going on with the economic system, and why is it that it is incapable of understanding the inequalities and the climate crisis and just doing anything. And what you have created is a way to apply this, because I could just ask you here how you have drawn from ecological economics even to write your book, right? You were inspired by ecological economics and heterodox. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, good. I was just about to jump in and say, can I tell you a little bit about that? Because I just right here, I want to just acknowledge it. So in making the presentation I made, I reduced, I couldn't show everything. So what I didn't show is a diagram that actually really shows, I don't know if I can quickly pull it up now. No, I'm not going to try and do that. No. Okay. Yes. All of this for me comes from ecological economics. So when I was, when was it? I don't know, about 15 years ago, I was doing jury service, which involves listening to a court case, but also sitting quietly in a room in between while they're in, out, the lawyers are arguing. And I took with me this book I'd bought that I thought, you know what, I'm actually going to read that book. It's called Beyond Growth by Herman Daly. And I sat in the juror's room at the back, sort of going in and out of this quite dramatic case, but then going in the room at the back, and my mind was like, whoa, going in these massive somersaults. And the thing, I had that very momentary mind shift change with Herman Daly's work of, his empty world, the square inside the circle. Oh, the economy used to be small in a big world, and it kind of worked to say externalities, it'll go out there somewhere. Oh, the world's so big. And then you've got full world, the big square banging up against the edge of the circle, right? You remember that square, it's touching the edge of the circle. That bang, just that, I didn't even need to read the rest of the book. That was so mind-changing for me. And it made me think, why was I never taught to think like this? It really affirmed my rejection of the economics because it gave me something else. But it wasn't quantified. It was a concept. About 10 years later, I had twins. I became a mother. I was on maternity leave for a year. I came back to my job at Oxfam after a year away, and somebody said, oh, here's some slides of here are some things that have been going on over the past year. This is in 2009. And one of the slides they put in front of me was this picture of the planetary boundaries. There was a circle, and there were these red lines shooting over the edge of the circle. And I had this boom moment. Oh, that is Herman Daly's full world. And those goddamn natural scientists have gone and quantified it. And they've called them, they've named this biosphere, they've called it the planetary boundaries, the life supporting systems. And they've gone and put numbers, and we're not a little square touching the edge of the circle. We are massively overshooting that circle. That was the moment for me. I thought, this is the beginning of a new economics. This is the beginning of ecological economics. It's been quantified by the Earth System scientists. And I was sitting at my desk in Oxfam, big open plan office, surrounded by people campaigning for the rights for all of education and health, campaigning to raise money to fund to tackle a climate-induced famine in the Sahel. And I thought, hang on, if there's an outer limit of our use of Earth's resources, and that's natural science and the ecologists saying, throwing down the gauntlet to mainstream economics, thus far and no further. I thought, what is the social justice corollary with that? And if there's an outer limit, there's an inner limit too. Yes, and we've been calling it human rights for decades. It's the right of every person. So I drew in this inside circle, and boom, it was a donut. And that's where it began. So all of this work is profoundly based in ecological economics. That is the number one. And the diagram I've drawn called the embedded economy, it's the economy and society in the living world, right? Many people have drawn this. And then inside the economy, market and state and household and commons. Let's bring in Eleanor Ostrom. So yes, this is, and thank you for inviting me to say this, Rico, because in this context, it's totally embedded in a one version of an enlivening ecological economics in practice. And what I love about it is that when you introduce it to people, you don't have to say ecological economics, feminist economics, complexity economics, and you just say, well, obviously the economy is a subset society, and we're all part of the living world, and everyone just goes, It's like, and sometimes when last thing I know, I'm giving a long answer. You got me excited. Sometimes people say, and I bet you get this. They say, well, I have to admit, I've never actually studied economics, and I say, you know what? That's your superpower. You have not been indoctrinated. You are free. You do not have to unload all that intellectual baggage. Just start here now. You're going to get it so much quicker than all of us who have to like, oh, hang on, what? So don't ever apologize for not having studied economics. Let's study it now together, and let's start with 21st century economics, and it starts with ecological economics.
I really, really appreciate that. It's so inspiring, and I don't know, there is no words to describe how much we all relate to what you're just talking about right now, and just so grateful that you found a way to apply it, and we can move from theory to action, which we talk so much about. There's a question here I think is important. How does the donut work in the rural context?
Oh, in the rural context, thank you for asking that, and I hope I was clear. I kept saying city, 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 which is like a little, it's an abbreviation for place, but you can absolutely use it in a rural context. So in Cornwall County Council in the UK, which is a very rural county in the UK, they took the donut and they made their own decision-making tool using the donut. So again, moving away from this kind of cost-benefit analysis and growth, they looked at all the social dimensions that they are focusing on and the ecological. And now whenever they have an infrastructure project in Cornwall, they use this decision-making wheel to say, are we, at least don't be harming and making things worse? Are we improving things? And how can we redesign this project to make it better? So it absolutely can be used in a rural context. And let me add to that, that any city or urban area should also recognize that it's deeply connected, at least to its surrounding rural areas, and should see itself as part of that whole. So there immediately comes a question, are we just Brussels, or are we Brussels and the surrounding regions? And that's part of building those networks. How can we build the networks and do community wealth building so the city doesn't isolate itself from the place? So yes, it can be used in that rural context. Going back to Elinor Ostrom, she always talked about polycentric governance. There's no one right level to do this. I'm in a place right now that's doing it at almost the smallest scale, at the neighborhood, a few sets of streets. Or do we do it as a city? Or do we do it as a city region? Or a watershed? That would be a very ecologically grounded scale to do it at, the watershed. Or do we do it as a state or a nation or an island nation like Barbados? We're learning. This is the action lab. We're all experimenting with 21st century design. I think we need it, as Elinor Ostrom would say, well, you kind of need it all levels, and it's all going to be a bit fuzzy and messy between them. Things don't add up perfectly, but start using agency where it's finding. So we went where the energy was. It started with cities. And I know that through peer-to-peer inspiration, that's why on my map, you'll probably see more cities than anything else. But once nations start doing it or communities start doing it, that generates a new level of peer-to-peer inspiration.
Thank you so much. And it's 2 p.m. here on the East Coast of the United States. And I know you have to go back to your work, boots on the ground, implementing ecological economics, donut economics, like you said. And we are so thankful and appreciative for your time, and we hope to work with you in the future. And
well, I'm really, really thankful that you invited me to be part of this. And I just think this kind of re-education that we're doing, we're stepping in, we're all choosing to be here. This is where the energy is, isn't it? And this is the education in the 21st century economics we know we want to create. So the minute you asked me, I was like, I'm in. So please, let's keep connecting. And I'd love to connect you with others in our team. Please, everybody, anyone who's interested in these ideas, browse, or please step in, join our community, find other people around you, find tools and that are useful for you, and contribute them, because I really believe that 21st century economics will be practiced first and theorized later. We've got some great starting points collectively of ecological and feminist and complexity economics, but really it's actually the practice through which I personally learned so much, and a humility of those who actually say, yeah, thanks for the ideas. I'm actually doing it. It's hard. It's really hard, but we learn so much back from that. So let's put these ideas into practice. And it's really great to be here with you today.
Thank you. Take care. And let's see you soon.
Yes. Bye.
And for everyone else, thank you for having joined this course for the past 4 days. It was a pleasure. It was very moving to have so many people interested in joining us. And I would like to again thank John and Josh Farley for believing in doing this to begin with, because if you don't have your advisors believing in what you're doing, this probably, I mean, honestly, you have to have a vision too, but the support is always indispensable. I don't know if they have some
all the
final
thanks
words.
go to you, Rigo. I know a lot of people have reached out to me and said what a wonderful job you've done. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to the students who you thanked at the beginning of today's session. That was a real team effort. But Rigo, thank you so much.
Yeah, we had confidence in you, Rigo. You over-delivered, and I hope this is going to be an annual event now that you initiated. So
Great. Thank you.
rock on, man.
So for everyone else, if you're still have the energy, the enthusiasm to end the course, please join our breakout sessions. The Zoom link has been posted in the chat. And also I posted it on the Slack for day 4. So please join us now in 2 minutes.
Yeah. And I'll just say, I encourage everyone to pick someone to take notes. And as Rigo has emphasized, post those to the Slack. It's wonderful to kind of share with everyone what you all talked about. And beyond that, Rigo, do you have any specific directions for us?
Just go over there and we'll just discuss what happened with donor economics, and let's see how we can actually move from theory to action. Let's reflect on what we learned in the last 4 days, and how we can move from that theory, right, that we learned, to how we can actually implement it, and how everything that we learned too is helping us rethink economics for people on the planet. So let's reflect. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you all.